So first of all, thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. Thank you to Yashwantrao Chavan Center and respected Member of Parliament, Supriya Yelery, for inviting me for this. Okay, thank you. And the very onset, let me thank Purva deeply and Mridul, who has been, quite instrumental making me a citizen and a resident of Mumbai. It has its own recognition, and I'm trying to be part of Mumbai community, and then the entire people think thanks over here, thanks to him. So today's topic is quite different. I'm trying to make it little controversial, so I can instigate you, intimidate you, so you can end up asking a lot of questions, and also hold me responsible for making any judgmental errors, knowingly or unknowingly. The first incident of this I keep on telling to all my students when it comes to international relations. International relations is a very fluid topic and discipline, and we're talking about a very person who was non-American by birth. He was German, and that German by birth person becomes Secretary of State of United States. The person then changes the entire equations of two big powers. I would not talk about great powers or the superpowers over here. I'm talking about Henry Kissinger. And that China which Kissinger has turned into an adult boy, or something, who is going to claim his stake in global relations, has been trying to change the entire landscape of international relations. So the title of the lecture is "Person to a Country Which Is Not Coming From," right? But knowing that Kissinger's role in international, important to understand why somebody like Kissinger, who is he is seen as instrumental in. This was the one person who has who had a handshake with all the Chinese presidents, starting with Chairman Mao, Deng Xiaoping, the second semi-chairperson and the president, then Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and the latest one is Xi Jinping. You would find hardly any one of that magnitude of a person who has lost it after his retirement in 77. 73 he got a Nobel Prize, very again distinctive area of it. This was the same person who was not criticizing the apartheid in Africa, South Africa, and this was the person who got China to the center stage, and he is the only person who had been favorite in China circle. And I would rather make a very light note comment over here is that if there is anybody else who is revered in China apart from these five presidents is Henry Kissinger. And when Henry Kissinger passed away last year, there was a lot of mourning, a lot of sorrow, a lot of grief in China, and in decision-making circles, that we lost somebody who could still go and whisper in the ears of American president. Whether that is with regard to the trade war, with regard to the any contentions, whether that is South China Sea or anything. Kissinger had a golden gate pass to the all alleys of power and politics. See, he was one person who could influence it. But how did the entire story start? And it's a complete circle. If you remember, in 2021, China completed, out of 2 centenaries, 1 centenary. 1 centenary is, it completed 100 years of Communist Party of China, right? But apart from these 2 centenaries where China completed its, or Communist Party completed its first centenary, there were other many centenaries which were running parallel. And that one of the centenaries were actually Xi Jinping congratulating, talking, inviting Henry Kissinger to come to China and again talk in favor of this country. Okay, the flow of my talk in approximately next 45 minutes, I'm going to divide into 3 broad sections. The first section would be dealing with retrofitting. Why did US change its position? Why did US want China to be part of the global systems, where China was itself thinking itself as odd because of the communist origin, because of believing in the Bolshevik revolutions, following Soviets. Chinese were out and very odd over here, of odd fitting. With the big, heavy lifting, Kissinger and the Chinese leadership got China into the mainframe. That's why we call it retrofitting. That's the first section of our talk. The second section is a transition, when China learns to leap, moving away from the baby stepping, leaping. And China uses the retrofitting for its benefit, and China rises. Third section is inverting. I'm talking the same 3 subtopics. That is the systematic optics, structural change, and narratives. Same in inverting, the last section. China uses, interestingly, very dramatically, the same model, the model which US used to bring China on the table. China uses the same elements and variables to tell US, United States, and rest of the world, we have arrived, now let us have our own say. Okay? Let's starting with the first one. The first one is very important over here. The first one is the optics. And why optics is very important? Damlisa knows actually. Before you write your screenplay, and well before you direct something, you need to have an optics, a vision of what you're going to do. It need not to be on the paper. It needs to be in the optics. It needs to be in your subconscious. Bring it to the subconscious, bring it in front of you, and then write it down and say, okay, this is my optics. My optics is what I want to be. But before you think what I want to be, you need to think about the entire ecosystem, the environment, how you want or what you want to be. The very important optics which created China image among the Americans was divided between the 2 schools. One was John Fairbank, and second was Paul Cohen. Fairbank was Cohen's teacher, and Cohen, being a student, had to read what Fairbank was talking about. Now, interestingly, the entire history of China from 19th century onwards until half of the 20th century was defined from the Fairbankian perspective. What Fairbank thought of China is that China's existence is because of the Western models, because of the West. It is the Western impact which is deciding what China wants to be. Very interesting over here. So I'll give you an example. When China talks about century of humiliations, it talks about West, right? When China talks about Opium War, it talks about West. When China talks about Taiping Rebellion, Christianity, China talks about West. When China talks about Boxer Rebellion, 1899, China talks about the West. That China lost the identity of themselves to the Fairbankian school. It was the Fairbankian school which was telling the Chinese, hey, listen, you don't have a story. You don't have a history here. The West came, and that's why you got into the pages of history. It defeated the existence of China in the first place. The Fairbank was saying that it is we who internationalized you. You did not internationalize yourself because you did not have an existence. The Paul Cohen, student of Fairbank, takes exactly opposite stage. Why? From 1949 onwards, if you see in the international relations, we'll talk very elementary sometimes and we'll really talk sometimes, 40,000 feet. But I'll try to fly in between and try to make you acquainted with a lot of these facts. When 1949, Mao established PRC, People's Republic of China, the West was looking very closely what this China is all about. Are each China a satellite of Soviet Russia? Or is China another, experiment ground for communism of Maoism, talking about agrarian reforms, not talking about the worker class, but talking about the peasants. What this China is all about. From 1949 onwards until mid-1960s, the Americans were clueless what this China is all about. What is China's metabolism? It's confusion. And those who were more confused would go back to the Fairbanks School and read that, oh, this China is the same thing. This China, the communism, talks about exploitations, and it is the same China which has been ruled by the Communist Party and says that, okay, because we've been exploited, humiliated, we need to stand up. Fairbanks School had absolutely whitewashed the brain of the Chinese to think that they had their own existence, and then the other contending European and American schools of knowing what China was about. Mid-1955, Korean War happens, and Southeast Asia, slowly Korea, they all start walking into the, Cold War zone. And Paul Cohen understands this is something different. If China was all about impact of West, why it is talking about its role in Korea, its role in Indochina, its role in Vietnam. And then Paul Cohen comes with another thought. He says, no, to know China better, we have to read China. So China is not outlying at the corners and the boundaries of international relations, but at the main frame. It is this China we have to know better. So these optics among the American schools, American thinkers, leadership, was absolutely changed by the contending thought processes between these two schools. One school, Fairbanks, which says that West is important, and then China is one of the factors. Cohen says, no, East is important because we're moving slowly after the Second World War. We're moving slowly towards the East, and that's the reason we have to understand China, right? Well, now, once you have optics in your mind, that, okay, this is a broad sketch I have in my mind. Now you start thinking about what are the structural imperatives. Okay, if you want to know China better, if you want to bring China in the mainframe, you need to have a plan, right? Now you have a story. Okay, you have a protagonist, you have all the other variables and players of your play in place. Now you need to think how you want to dramatize it, how you want to shoot it, right? In international relations, we call it structural imperatives. And what were the structural imperatives when US was talking about its SWOT? Okay, this is all about the weaknesses, it's about successes, opportunities, and threats. The Kohenian school gave the American leadership a fantastic scheme of structural imperatives. Why you need China in the center stage. And what they talk about? Soviet Russia. Why Soviet Russia? Interlocked chaos. From 1949 onwards, if you see, and breaking the relationship between China and Soviets over the leadership of about the Komintans, Americans wanted to take the leverage of the rift between the Soviets and China. And they wanted to keep Soviets away at an equal distance away, and so that they want to manipulate the international relationship, they can come at the center stage. Because of the Soviet Russia, and remember Soviet Russia was the one who were trying hard to shoot people out in the orbit and get more leverage and advantage compared to US. The first important thing in structural imperatives of the American optics was to contain Soviet Russia. The second one was Taiwan. Remember, 1949, after Chiang Kai-shek and nationalist government collapsed, okay, in Chongqing, today's Chongqing, and then the plight, and then they went to Formosa, Taiwan was formed, ROC, Republic of China. The important case for Americans were what to do with Taiwan, because Taiwan was not going to play a major role, a weightlifter, as far as American foreign policy was concerned. So as a result of it, the second important variable of a structural imperatives Americans were thinking about, thinking from the Kohanian school, as I go along, the sentences become longer. Stop me if you don't get that, I'm confused. And as a result of it, the Taiwan became another important structural imperatives for US to think from the Kohanian brains and ideas. China. Asymmetries, adapting and socialization. Kohanian school somewhere imbibed on the minds of American leadership, China can be domesticated in a very day-to-day routine language. Why? Because China has a more nuisance, and Soviet Russia is more nuisance because of China. So let's contain China if we don't try or be successful in containing Soviet Russia. So as a result of it, American leadership thought that, we need to socialize China to bring down the asymmetries of US with the East. The asymmetries were already exposed when Americans were failing in Korea, Americans were failing in Vietnam. As a result of that was another factor which influenced the American thinking of going closer to China. Americans had always a wish to control the pan-Pacific power. Today, America is talking about Indo-Pacific. But just before Indo-Pacific was conceived, elaborated, just before that, Asia-Pacific was something, which America was obsessed of. And it knew that it could make the relations across Pacific predictable and stable by having China on board. So once you have an optics ready, when you have a SWOT model of structural imperatives ready, the third important thing becomes narrative. Now you know that I have to do something. I have to how to do it, but now you have to do the narratives. Simple story of a child when he wants to play cricket, want to buy a bat ball, he goes to his father and he creates his own narrative, convincing his father that why he wants money. The same thing happens over here. Americans have now to build the narrative. Build the narrative for two things. One, to tell the domestic audience why it is going for China, why it is going after China. One. Second thing, tell the rest of the world that why it is choosing China. That narrative is very important. Now if you connect these three things, I have an optic, I have a structural imperatives, I need narrative. Without narrative I cannot move ahead. So the narrative starts taking shape. And I'm quoting directly from Kissinger. Kissinger was playing an important role from early 60s. He was talking about China. And thanks to many things, one of the thankful factor that we did not have mobiles and we did not have direct flights, it benefited, but no other than our dearest neighbor, Pakistan. Pakistan was brokering this relationship between Americas and China's. And if you remember, any flight which was crossing continents to Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, an American airliner would make a stopover in Pakistan for refueling. From these dates, the early conceiving of the possible marriage between the American interest and the Chinese interest started taking shape. In international relations, you never know what happens. Really, it is sometimes very unpredictable. So that's the reason I said, if we did not have a stopovers in Pakistan and then the mobiles, it wouldn't have happened. And Pakistan wouldn't have been where it is today. That story is different. Let me quote. There are 4 important steps, the narratives Kissinger created when he wanted to bring China at the center stage. First one, survival of China. The first important motive, I'm quoting this from his book on China. coming straight away from the horse's mouth, where Kissinger says, in 1968, the United States decided publicly and declared that they had a strategic interest in the survival of China. Americans wanted the survival of China. 1968, 13 years, when the rift between the Soviets and the Chinese become apparent. Now, you will be surprised actually what was so unique about China that Americans were thinking about survival of China. They did not want to let Chinese importance, or let's call it nuisance power, to go away. And Americans wanted to now breed it further. Americans wanted to manipulate it further. So survival of China was very important for Kissinger. If you want to make China survive, the next question comes, okay, you want to have a pet. Second question comes, how you train a pet, right? Second question is the mentality and socializing China. These were the terms Kissinger was talking in declassified congressional documents. And he was saying that if we want China to survive, we have to domesticate it. We have to mentally train them. And where he says that the American diplomat mentality is different from the Chinese mentality. American mentality could be absolutely compartmentalized, where American can think, yes, diplomacy and military actions are different. That means what Americans wanted to tell the Chinese is that Taiwan is important for us, you are also important for us. The mental training Chinese Americans were thinking to give to China started happening 15 years before the actual 1971 meeting happened in June. And then 78, when the membership has been given to PRC. 83, Shanghai Communique being signed between the Americans and the Chinese. Americans were telling the Chinese that, you need to adapt to this mentality, which is very important. And they were making public statements in America that, we are concerned that to end the disequilibrium, we want China to survive, and at the same time, we want to train and mentally change the mindsets of the Chinese. Third important factor, how do you do it? You want to socialize it. Before that, you want to adopt China. How do you do it? You do it by opening to China. Now, let me go back little in the history, say about 130 years, 140 years. We are here 1968. Let me go back to the first quarter of the 19th century, when printing press were becoming quite a prevalent technology in Europe among the whites. Let me be a little racist over here. When the printing press were becoming prominent, and when the West wanted more natural resources, they used to read out stories in the night to the children saying that there is a country called China, yes, India also, and we don't know how people live there. There is a dragon, there is a king emperor, we do not know how that looks like. Let's understand that. The Americans opening to China, Europeans opening to China is always a circular phenomenon. It always happened every 70 to 80 years. From early 19th century until the mid of 20th century, it happened 2 times. The first time happened in the first quarter of the 19th century. The second happened in the end of the 19th century. And this was the third opening. The Americans wanted to know about China. So, opening to China. If we want to make China part of the global systems, and if I can socialize it, i.e. Henry Kissinger, along with Mr. Nixon, what I want to do is I want to open to China. And here he says that opening to China was a part of a larger strategic plan. This was not an accident. So he says that there was a lot more understanding gone into before opening China and understanding China and how the China can help US to achieve the equilibrium. So it was important to enter in China, or maybe make the Chinese entry into the global system possible. And second thing he says that the Chinese were extremely self-reliant. Remember this quote, because I'm going to quote the same lines before we end today's lecture. So let me repeat that quote. He says, the Chinese were extremely self-reliant and did not understand how American leaders thought their self-reliance would hurt their relationship with America. the Chinese were still not sure why Americans are coming to China. Because by this time, the Chinese were not dependent on Americans. So Chinese were absolutely thinking, what are we going to give back to Americans? But only it's Americans, specifically. Mr. Henry Kissinger knew what he wants at the end of the day. Right? So this importance of opening to China was very important, which is going to get converted into modernizing and liberalizing China. Very important to all of us. Since we all people fall into the category of Buddhijeevis, let me elaborate it more. Opening to China was the first step. But when you want to make China dependent on America, you have to modernize China, right? If you don't modernize China, it will never be dependent on you. To modernize China, you have to train Chinese to think in a liberal forms. China thinking in liberal forms starts tasting the best fruits and harvest of advanced industrial nations, technology, trade, investments, then China is automatically coupled. Okay? It looks little engineering and bit of, very scientific, but this is how the Americans were thinking. They have to make survival of China. They want to socialize China. For that, they have to enter into China. And after entering into China, make China test the best of the harvest of IR, global relationship, and interdependencies. Once China is interdependent, America says, hola, we are here. We achieved what you wanted to do. A very small strip takeoff, it looks like. But it did not happen that way. If it had to happen that way, we wouldn't be sitting here. We never have Doklam and Galwan had happened, right? And all the script of this started taking shape back then. Okay. Now we move into the second phase of the lecture, which is very important, which talks about the transition. Remember I said, once US had the optics, once US knew that, okay, this is how I'm going to benefit China coming on board, and this is how I'm going to put the narratives on. Now, China knew, okay, it has arrived. The entire story, I'm not going to say, all of you know, actually China was opened up. China reformed itself in the 1970s. 1978 was the milestone year when China started opening up. On 4 fronts, China adopts pragmatism. Opening up, that is opening up to the outside world, because China was isolated. China kept itself isolated. Second, foreign policy. China always thought that foreign policy is nothing extension of your revolutionary ideas, ideologies, and your political sentiments. Foreign policy was done through more sentimental, emotional, ideological contours, narratives. Third, reforms. Chinese economy was approximately $93 billion. India was approximately 93. 1980 it became 112, we were 118. Approximately same stage until 1918. And then multilateralism. China always believed that it is always a divided world. Let's walk through this one by one. I'm saying the second stage, thanks to American opening to China, it is doing this rapprochement with China, the center stage start appearing, and then China starts coming on the center stage, starting with the opening up. China knew that the entire distress which has taken a center stage and hijacked the political ideologies and the importance of the leadership was because of the distress. The entire Chinese society, economy, and every section of the Chinese society were absolutely in distress. They did not know what is happening to this country. Remember, the great proletarian revolution, cultural revolution had left the Chinese economy shattered. This was the same country after 1949 were expecting, promised that there will be equality. Okay, you will be having access to resources, control, and then you will not have any inequality in the society. That was a major thing the Chinese were scared of, and because it was in isolation, it wanted to end that distress. And by ending the distress, what they meant is they wanted to connect with the outside economies, outside countries, be more interdependent. And when they thought of becoming interdependent, the Chinese were thinking of a business model which was more export-led. The Chinese were having this, the Walt Malthus theory calls the demographic dividend. China had this demographic dividend. But interestingly, when China started opening up, the important thing which was at the bottom line was all about how China would immediately, without losing time, emulate something. So emulating was very important. So far, China was emulating Soviets, but the Soviets emulating did not offer anything to the Chinese. So the Chinese were looking for an alternative of a Western model, copying the Western model of export-led growth. Third important thing, romancing with the markets. So it was not only about for the domestic consumption or for the domestic labor or for the domestic demography, they wanted to open up the economy or to have relations with the outside country, but also China wanted to give or export not only to America but to Europe, to Middle East, to Southeast Asia. If you start talking about the Chinese engagement with the Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa, Latin America, West Asia, it's all started because China left back or left behind its isolation. So the romancing with the markets was the third important thing which led China to think that they have to open up. This is all thinking, now if you can connect the dots, Henry Kissinger wanted to open China for their own benefit. China opened itself for their own benefit. Now their own two times is different. Their own first was for US benefit, second their own was for the Chinese. Chinese were getting smarter here. Chinese knew we have now opened up. We now do need to actually connect with as many markets, as many friends, as many outside, liberal market economies which will accept us as one of the important actor in international relations, and lower trade barriers. So what happened in 1978 when China wanted to bring in or to have relationship with the outside world? It had only two clauses. One, it will go to every country, say that, are we one China or two China? One China? Okay, that's good. What do you want? Market. What do you want after that? Lower the tariffs. Okay, we lower the tariffs. Finish. Simple two-line dilemma, two-line agenda of Chinese engagement with the outside world. And it happened effectively. So as a result of it, you would see that opening up was smoothened. And after the opening up, what came after that was reforms. Reforms were phenomenal. If you see 1960s, the Chinese economy was as backward than Sierra Leone. It was as backward than few countries from Africa. 1960s, reforms, trade liberalizations, opening up special economic zones, emulating the Western model of export-led growth. And this export-led growth was absolutely different. China was not going by theory. What I would do today. Oh, I want to improve myself. Okay, let's start with Adam Smith. No, he was not Indian. Let's start with Raghuram Rajan, what he says. Chinese were not. Chinese were quite practical. They said, okay, keep them aside. What I want is all money, how I can utilize it. Historically, the growth a country achieves in 4 generations, China squeezed in 1 generation. Only 1 generation. 78 reforms takes place. 2007, China's growth rate per year, the GDP growth rate was 14%. 14%. Now, if we divide from 1978 to 2007 and just make an average, 9% growth. Average growth 9%. China could do that. And to end the status that we are not as backward as in African countries, we are now economically power, so we can challenge people. We can challenge countries now. Second thing, decentralization. Remember one thing, why China sustained, did not perish. It was also the American interest, it was also the non-Asian economic interest in China, but at the same time, the China adapted itself. There were a lot of liberalizations were happening in the world, in 1960s and early 70s, right? Poland did, Czechoslovakia did. A lot of Eastern Europeans were doing that, opening up. But why did China do it? China could stimulate it and control it. They decentralize it in a shock, in a gradual system, in a gradual way. China opened up something, then they went to the next stage, they went to the next stage. As a result of it, China was learning from its own mistakes. China was standing up. Next was regional development strategies. What happened post-Mao? The coastal regions were first opened up. Okay, then the other regions were opened up. Now, if you connect, the Chinese were requiring FDIs for this thing. Americans were giving the FDIs. I remember a story. George Bush Sr. wrote a book. And in that book, because George Bush Sr. was in China in 1976, and then he was appointed back in 1984. George Bush Sr., same person who invaded Iraq and the war. He wrote in the book, George Bush Sr., after 78, we, America, started investing in China. I was very sure by 1984, we will be benefiting in bilateral trade. And we will, win the socializing China, or bringing China to the main forum of global relations. But if you see the trade figures in 1982, the Americans were losing to Chinese. What Kissinger, before retirement, 1977, thought of socializing China, bringing China to the center stage, and America is going to win the war against everyone. Soviets, with the Western West Asian powers, with the Cubans, everyone. But the things started changing over here, because after opening up, China could maximize the benefit of these FDIs in converting some of its regional pockets as attraction, so that FDIs keep coming, and then Americans kept on investing in these places. I'm talking Americans specifically because it was this period of Cold War, at the height of Cold War, when Americans were still selling arms to Taiwan, when Americans were still trying to figure out what happens to the strategic arms reduction treaties. It kept on investing in China. It was not selling arms, mind it, it was giving investments. That is what China wanted. China was getting more smarter by degrees, smaller degrees. Per capita income. Now, if you see that, the per capita income, the way that it has increased, China is still, in the 80s, as far as the per capita income is concerned. But, this is the country which claims we have pulled out 900 million people out of poverty, absolute poverty. Now, I'm not here to praise, but I'm giving you the contrast, what China was talking about, all thanks to Henry Kissinger. Kissinger wanted China to be in the center stage. China comes to the center stage, and China starts dictating, now I want to change this, I want to change the script. It happens in Bollywood also, no? You get the big star and he says that no, up script change kar do. Do line yahan ka wahan kar do, and I want this actress and I want this theater to release the film. China was trying to act like that. Going to the next one, foreign policy. Now, interestingly, China was trying to get at the pole position. Remember mid-1960s, Americans were telling what China is made for. In 1950s, Soviets were telling China what you are made for. In 1980s and 90s, China was telling everyone what we are made for. Let's try. Let's have some kind of arbitration over it. Let's have a convergence over it, and let's see where we stand. Quick run into these things. To preserve China's independence, the first important thing, what China picked from Kissinger's work plan. Remember the first work plan? Survival of China, right? China picks up the same screenplay over here. He says that, no, fine. What we want in the end of the day is we want our survival. China should survive. And when they say China, it is not just the mainland China. It is China plus Taiwan, China plus Hong Kong, China plus Macau. The concept of Akhand China, okay, for them. This was something. Who catalyzed it? Who did this? Mr. Henry Kissinger, who brought me to Mumbai and talked to you about him. We remember him. Still he's in the grave, but we still remember him fondly for doing this thing. Second thing, lying low foreign policy. In 1980s and 1990s, when China was developing, China was trying to accelerate its growth, the Deng Xiaoping says that don't need to be smarter. You need to be wiser. What he meant, you need to lie low and don't make noises. So you'll be picked and you'll be blamed for something. The lying low foreign policy worked so well for China because China slowly gained the momentum, traction to come in the center stage. And that helped China tremendously. Harmonious world, peaceful rise of China, because Hu Jintao, Chinese say this thing in secret. China fondly remember Mao because he created PRC. They remember Deng Xiaoping because he introduced reforms. Jiang Zemin because he was a taskmaster. He was a very strong headmaster in China. Hu Jintao, he could hardly open his mouth. And then Chinese call it, those 10 years are lost years. 8 years are lost years for China. But Hu Jintao did one thing. He came up with one smart phrase which China could use it. He said, let's build the harmonious world. And then he attached a term saying, for harmonious world, peaceful rise of China is very important. And this term became very important because the first time China started using the term called rights, RIC. And that changed the entire artboard for China. Now the artboard was talking about the rights. The new word which actually Deng Xiaoping was even hesitant to use. And as a result of it, the core diplomatic objectives of China, comes with a lot of the sprouting of small but important variables of foreign policy making. And China could think about these variables because it was standing, it was rising, and it was making its position visible, determinant in global affairs. It starts with economic development. Second with reassurances. China wanted to reassure the world community that we are aggressive but self-sustained, but we want to rise peacefully. At the same time, wherever it went in Africa, in Latin America, they just said, we are coming from a history of humiliation, exploitations. So our rights is quite important for every one of you. My rights is important for it's so important to say that keeping my dog, whether it barks or does anything, is good for you also. China was able to convince this, and China sold this thing so convincingly to the rest of the world. Reducing Taiwan's international space. You have the recent news in 7-8 days back, Taiwan is left with only 12 countries which recognize them, right? Now that number has been substantially decreasing over the period of time. So reducing the space, the Taiwan space, maneuverability as far as Taiwan, its legality is concerned, and countering constraints. China has always been talking about everybody plots against it, whether that's European countries or it's America. So China talks very vehemently that please do not constrain us. We are here for your benefit. Okay? And we produce cheaper things. We give it to you. Nobody can beat it. And we are the one who will talking about building, making your economies prosperous. Anything you require, we would give it to you. You need loans, bracket debts, we'll give you. You need trade, bracket deficits, we'll give you. We need products, bracket lower qualities, we'll give you. So this assurance is telling Chinese that please do not talk, do not block us, do not constrain us. expanding and diversifying access to natural resources. This is a relatively new idea, but the Chinese economic statecraft has been access to the important minerals, aspects of access to important natural resources. And when it comes to natural resources, Indian Ocean becomes important, the Red Sea becomes important, Houthis become important, Iranians become important, everything becomes important, right? So that changed the scheme over here. And most importantly, multilateralism. Now, as I said, in 1970, China always believed that it's a divided world. Well, the world could be first world, second world, third world, but it's always a divided world. But China comes up with something unique after being indoctrinated with the American influence. It says that the entire world is connected, and most importantly is that China is now want to be connected with every forum, every architecture, and it wants to be at the center stage. China could not think about its isolation. China could not think about it could last outside the architecture where West is ruling, where US and European countries were ruling. So most important thing was that actually we want to be at the center stage. We want to be connected with every international organizations. But then how? Second thing is activism. If you just read how China has become from a silent watcher or silent audience to international organizations in 1960s, 70s, and from 1980s onwards, China become very active, and it takes part into deliberations in international institutions, international structures, international organizations. This is very important because over the period of from 78 onwards, China has become a part of 50 international organizations and more than 1,200 international non-governmental organizations. This is something what Kissinger wanted to socialize China for. Now, 1978, within 20, 30 years, Americans were patting themselves saying that, okay, now we have made China moderate, read Western. Now we have made China liberal, read market. Now we can dictate what China wanted to do for us, right? This is what the script was, if I'm correct over here, and if you could connect the dots from the beginning. China was doing a small but a steady transition to what it wanted to be is still, a counter force. In 1989, if you remember, every one of you, the famous Tiananmen Square incident happens. Remember that, right? Deng Xiaoping at the helm. And Hu Jintao was one of the cadre, very young chap. I can call chap as if I'm 80 years old, but just forgive me for that overstatement. But the statement coming from Henry Kissinger, he was retired 12 years back, 1977. He makes a statement. This statement is two-fold statement. First fold statement, where he says, no government in the world would have tolerated having the main square of its capital occupied for 8 weeks by tens of thousands of demonstrators who blocked the area in front of the main government building. He won the Nobel Prize. I feel still surprised. And he's saying that this is not acceptable. This is one part of it. Okay, he was against the demonstration and protest. Second part, very interesting thing. In China, demonstration of importance in the capital would unleash the lurking regionalism and voluntarism in the provinces. Kissinger was still thinking he is the Secretary of State of PRC, not United States. And he was convincing the rest of the world, hey, this is not possible. If China fails, what happens to my investments? Remember, before going to graves, he turned billionaire, Henry Kissinger. 1989, 12 years after his retirement, he was investing mad in China. And he did not want this to happen. What he reads most, a crackdown was therefore inevitable. Again, the same person won the Nobel Prize. I remember when I was preparing for my general knowledge exams, I would always by heart, who won the Nobel Prize? Now I repent. I remembered his name so fondly that I remember his name for all wrong reasons. This was Henry Kissinger. Year 1989, China was becoming a part of international organizations. China was trying to gear up for foreign investments. China was making friends. China was trying to get international. And then nobody could neglect the importance of China, right? Now, something important. That wasn't the only thing. Now, China comes up with most genius ideas of its statecraft. Now, enough of weaving Sovietized, called Bolsheviks, socialist, enough of tongue shopping. Now, the practical business. The Chinese are very good getting to the practical businesses. And only one person who can be equivalent and can be Chinese in the world is Donald Trump. You will see what happens this year actually after the elections. Because once he said, Donald Trump said, you want to do the business with Chinese, don't treat them in palatial places. Straightly take them to McDonald's. Give them burger and talk about the businesses. That's it. 2-minute job. Okay, let's come to the pragmatism and the business of doing things, statecraft. So, the 4 important components of China's statecraft. Again, I'm saying repeatedly, these are notions the Chinese have taken from our dearest Henry Kissinger. First one, state capitalism. We in economics have learned that visible hand, invisible hand. Those who haven't learned, raise their hands. I can still excuse you, don't worry about it. Because there is nothing called invisible hand in the United States also. So, state at the center, party at the helm, leader creating the narratives, telling party, we want to use this, use the state structure to do this. Simple thing. Who is controlling? State is controlling. Who is dictating? The party is dictating them. State capitalism. State is running the market. That is the nature of today's China. And the state was not made for running the markets. The state, if I remember now, Mao had said, the state will wither, right? Equality will last. Egalitarian would come. The utopian concept. But now, the state is deciding, I want this, I want to become rich. We are middle income trap. 900 people we have pulled out of poverty. We are stuck at 9,000. We are stuck at 13,000. Middle income trap. We want to grow further. State capitalism becomes, the driving force of China's statecraft. The Chinese state wants now to listen to the party and say that, okay, we want to change this thing forever. Second thing, economic statecraft. Well, if the state is at the center, what state is doing? It's a capitalism. It should let the market play important role. But it is the state, again, intervening in economic restructuring and bringing forward the geo-economic proactivism. Wherever there is an economic interest, you take any corner of the world. I'm not saying anything new over. You might have read this thing from number of sources. Any investment distantly happening in any corner of the world today is controlled by the Chinese. There is no free flow of capital. There is no free flow of even human resources. Chinese state wants to know everything. Every Chinese company today, the memorandum of associations, there is a clause, a new clause, that you have to have a party members. So there is nothing called, free flow markets, free flow investments. Economics, as envisaged by the state, decide the structure of transactional relationship. Right? Important thing. Third, the shift to a strong nation diplomacy. When, if you remember the famous quotes, to get rich is glorious. Deng Xiaoping never said that. Deng Xiaoping said something else, but it was interpreted out. Or maybe revolution is a party is again something when leaders did not say so. But the entire focus of 1978, when Deng Xiaoping was talking about opening up, he was telling people that please, you will get rich. You will control money capital, and then you decide what you want to do with it. You want to keep it with yourself, you want to reinvest it, reinvest it, reinvest it. How much you produce, your produces, how much share of the produces from the agriculture field, or the yield, you want to keep it with yourself, you want to sell it in the market, right? That was called a prosperous China. And that prosperous China was shifted to strong China. And that the famous statement in 2009 made by the Chinese leadership, where it is said that you have to do anything possible to pursue your interest. This was absolutely different from the Deng Xiaoping statement about, you have to hide your strength. The new leadership, the new China was talking about, you have to be proactive. You have to be assertive. And assertive, in Chinese case, we have seen assertiveness in South China Sea, assertiveness in territorial claims, assertiveness when it comes to global financial institutions, assertiveness when it comes to freedom of navigation, assertiveness when claiming the oil fields, rigs, assertiveness. So much of assertiveness. The China turns strong nation. The alliance system with Chinese characteristics. Very simple and very important over here. And many of us do not understand the nuances of it. What do we think? We use the terms alliances, networks interchangeably, right? We are so fond of using things interchangeably. Anything can interchange us. Chai can become a coffee, can become a tea, and then again can become anything. We are so fond of interchangeability. But in Chinese case, that interchangeability is a strategy. They want to keep things optically unclear. When it comes to alliances, when China says that we want to build alliances, they meant we want to build networks. What is the difference between alliances and network? There is a liability in alliances, right? If I have an alliance, there is an ethical liability. What is network? No liability. I'm free to walk out, right? China started building alliances which were actually networks. It did not want alliances. Why did not want alliances? Because Chinese history did not believe in alliances. Tianxia, the tributary system, were there alliances? There were no alliances. The Chinese knew that they have to hold upper hand. The world is absolutely hierarchical. We are complaining a lot about India, it's a hierarchical society. But look at China, communist society, still much more steeply hierarchical places. It is said in China that Mao washed everybody's head, bleached everybody's head. There is no class, but there are newer class emerging in China. And then the entire force or emphasis of China is, we want to have network or alliances, but it is not many to many, right? In alliances, everybody is equal, stakeholder. If there are 4 members in alliances, 1 is equal to 3, 3 is equal to 1, 2 are equal to 2, right? I make sense here, right? But what Chinese did? Chinese said, no, many to 1 is the equilibrium and network. So all of you, because I want you to move to left and right, stand straight. It's me. So the network China wanted to create its own unique identity. China plus many countries. China always wanted to create something, a network and alliances which China wanted China plus. Centrality. Don't forget this thing. I'm talking to you as if you're all my UOG students. Pardon me. But that's the excitement. So China wanted to create an alliance system, which was actually a network. China wanted to run away from the responsibility, taking accountabilities. And this China created, thanks to Henry Kissinger. We slowly move into the third thing. Many of you are Maharashtrians, right? तीसरा आणि शेवटचा सांगतो. But very important here. Because you're going to invert. You're going to invert something. I think this is more fascinating than making a movie. Now what I'm going to invert here? Optics. Remember my slide number 4? Back to optics. After Henry Kissinger holding China's hand, training baby steps, turning into an adulthood, and then China taking it forward, sprinting it out, knows its position and centrality in global affairs. And it grows so strong, so tall, and so sprintful and active that it develops its own optics now. This optics is, again, remember my slide number 5. Little bit of change. I spoke about Cohen and Fairbank, right? Now what happened? Interestingly, a drama arrives, okay? This is the Cohenian school which made China at the center of international relations, right? Now China replugged that Cohenian school and say that, oh listen, we are not only at the center, we are at the top, the Tianxia. We are not replugging the systems, replugging the optics. The China keeps feeding in you through its network of television, newspapers, and its friends, networks, which keeps on telling you that China is everything. China is the oldest, China is the brightest, China is the cleverest, and everything. You take mathematics, China is there. You take patents, China is there. You take sports, China is there. Go to Olympics, China is there. Wimbledon, China is there. Australia, China is there. Everything, China is there. And you forget about, hey, what is this? China is everywhere. So China replugs, takes the plug out of Cohenian school, replugs it, and now you see that the Cohenian school is speaking in Chinese and telling you, welcome. It is China. The world is China, nothing else. Okay? Fairbank school. Remember what Fairbank said? It's a Western impact which brought China to the frames of international relations, right? Be it anything in 19th century. It was the West. Now China cynicizes it and says that, yes, we believe in Fairbank, but just little change in that. It is now, in the present context, China is deciding what international system should be and what West should be doing it. And interestingly, I'll give you a very best example. China never believed in liberal thoughts. China never believed in rights. China never believed in individuals. But while getting socialized, China used those terms, rights, liberal forces, to become a part of international system. Now once they become part of international system, they start criticizing it. Right? This is something interesting. A principal will not give you an admission if you stand at the gate and say that this is the worst school, right? You stand at the gate of the school and say that, oh, this is the best school. You get admission, they graduate and say that, oh, this is the worst school. This is what China was doing. This is what China wants to do. Again, cynicizing the Fairbank school. It says that, yes, it was not Western impact which created which created China, but it was the Chinese impact which will create the Western world. Optics changed. Slide same here. Optics changed. Understand the story. Next. Okay, what is this replubbing of Cohenian school? It's called diplomacy. Now, this diplomacy is all about, it's a much more sophisticated version of replubbing of Cohenian school and also having some interface with the Fairbank school. And what diplomacy talks about, and again, I'm going to quote Kissinger. Remember I said I'm going to quote that again. Remember that, right? The same quote. Let me read the quote again. 10 seconds. I read this quote earlier also. The American diplomat mentality is completely different from the Chinese mentality. Kissinger said this thing, okay, in his book. American diplomats view military action and diplomacy as two separate things, while the Chinese view them as interconnected. American diplomacy prefers the specific over the general, while the Chinese diplomacy prefers the abstract over the practical. It took 40 years, Kissinger, to understand this. And world in 2023 talks, oh, how this had happened. And I think we're talking about Homo sapiens of Harari, right? We are supposed to be intelligent. We are supposed to vision something, right? The Americans could not vision that this China, we are going to baby step, sprint, is going to come and tell us, hey, look at us. We are abstract, but we want to teach you this. This diplomacy had changed the optics of China looking at the world, how it wants to look at the world. Now, going back to my second part, I talked about optics, right, in the first of my lecture. And then I said that, it is the structural imperatives which you have to view in your optics, right? Now, tell me, what were the Chinese structural, imperatives over here? The four important factors. SWOT policy. The strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. China learned this thing. You have known the term called mutant, right? When Americans were trying to deal China, and now China is trying to deal with America, you see a lot of similarities. That's the reason I keep the slide same. So you understand that this is the inverted model of retrofitting. Now Chinese inverted that entire model. Chinese are using their own SWOT models, which was absolutely used by the Americans, but they replaced their priorities with something else. The first one to start with, Bretton Woods Institution, 1944. 44 nations come together to decide dollar is the king. Dollar should be pegged with other countries. Dollar is everything. That is the wealth of West is important. Wealth of the West is the might. And that has been haunting Chinese like anything. Now, since China has become a member of a lot of the international organizations, have an important say in the global economics, geoeconomics, what it stops with is actually, we have to get rid of these Bretton Woods institutions. Second, Taiwan. I don't need to repeat this thing. Recent elections in Taiwan. So China's emphasis always has been to, with regard to Taiwan. Third is the governance. Restrictive multilateralism. China wants to use the multilateralism for its benefit, but China doesn't want to improvise multilateralism too much so that you ask a question to it. What best example you have none other than United Nations? China talks about, okay, I want reform in this, Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, WTO, everything. But you ask them, okay, what about the UNSC? Oh no, we'll talk about that later. That's not a priority. That is called a restrictive multilateralism. And then Pan-Pacific. Pan-Pacific, where the Chinese lock their horns with the Americans. Now, the last important part, the narratives. The Chinese have been building very interesting narratives to bring back them on the center stage, to deliver the SWOT, deliver the structural imperatives, and to fulfill the optics through number of things. The ends justify means. So ends are very important. What are the Chinese ends? First, reorienting the Western liberal order, as said. The Chinese are saying liberal order, it's okay, fine. If it's a liberal order, why you are keeping us outside the world systems of finances, world system of transactions, world system of technology sharing? So Chinese are using the liberal variables to criticize the West. Wolf warrior. Wolf warrior is something Chinese diplomacy is now known for famously. The term was used to say that the Chinese has always been reactive and has been always punitive when it sees it has been cornered. But the diplomacy has been turned as a wolf warrior. Neo-isolationism and Kissingerian exceptionalism. China today wants to go back to isolation. Coming back from isolation, having trade relations, interdependencies, but now China wants to go back, isolate itself, to say how different, how unique they are, and so that they want to preserve their identities, economic security, cultural security, and other things. And moral realism. Moral realism is something the Chinese are very proud of talking nowadays. They're saying that we are morally bound but realistically practical. This is very funny, and that's why I use the example. So best example of moral realism is killing a defenseless person is wrong. But if you give him a stick and say that, okay, I killed him because he was carrying a stick, right? The moral realism China wants to teach all of us. That is the narrative Chinese are building. Okay? Now, next one is, if your ends are clear, it becomes important now, what are your means? Now, if you try to judge the means the Chinese are adapting, are the principal axis of today's China foreign policy under Xi Jinping, it still talks about the ideology. The whatsoever returns, two whatsoevers. Mao was the one during the Cultural Revolution, the first whatsoever word, the term was used. Whatsoever our chairman says and whatsoever he does is fine. Now, Xi Jinping comes back to that in 2009, as I repeated earlier also. He says that we will actively pursue what you can do, what we can do, what we should be doing it at the cost of anything. Third thing is new multilateralism. This is again a statement. 19th Party Congress 2017 by Xi Jinping says that dialogue without confrontation, partnership without alliances. We can have a dialogue without confrontation, and we can have alliances without alliances. Remember I said that? The Chinese uniqueness of alliances, Chinese do not want to be part of alliances, but they want to have partnerships. Chinese want to have the transactional relationship, not relationship which will bind them morally. And I think this is my so-called last slide. On top of it, China talks about as a new foreign policy. And this new foreign policy, which talks about 4 important characteristics, is, if you can see, rule taking, rule breaking, rule changing, and rule making. China used to be a rule taker, turned into a rule breaker, turned into a rule changer, and now wants to be a rule maker. We want to make the rule. Important transition in the Chinese foreign policy making. Comprehensive China rejuvenation plans. You have a Belt and Road Initiative which was launched in 2013. 2017 was the first forum was held. Apart from that, China has launched Global Development Initiative in 2021, Global Security Initiative in 2022, Global Civilization Initiative in 23, and then Global Artificial Intelligence Initiative in 2023. The canvas has just broadened 180 degrees. Decoupling and de-risking. Now China knows very well about that. If you want to just sideline and circumvent West and the institutions the West has created, it has to diversify. At the same time, it has to create its own production lines and supply lines and focus on the markets, and at the same time create currencies so that it can evade pressure points. And the last one is the technological hegemony. China has always been worried that West would push itself and corner China, so that China would never come out of that that force that China has been put under of technological deprivation, and China is quite critical and concerned about it. My last slide. This is my first slide, turned to be my last slide actually, because I went into flashback mode. Well, now again I'm quoting Henry Kissinger. He says that China's rise will usher in the golden age of Asian prosperity, and Chinese products, culture and values will be the standard for the world. However, China must be prepared to struggle and prevail in the contest for strategic preeminence. What China wants, it is absolutely near to that. It wants the Tianxia order, it wants to make the rules, and it wants to keep all its soft power capabilities at the center of global relationship. That's where we have come with the help of no other than Henry Kissinger. There I stop, and I'm open for question and answers. Thank you so much.